Hello and welcome to this video on Trofim Lysenko, the Soviet Union's answer to some of the West's great minds in agronomic developments. He was a biologist and agronomist in his own right, but rejected Mendelian genetics in favor of his own distorted invention. Despite this, his timing and knowledge led to favors from Stalin due to a fortuitously timed famine and his own origin story. He survived and thrived due to the political circumstances of the time and a failure of the USSR to allow free inquiry, challenge to established ideas, and the scientific method. He was born in 1898 to a Ukrainian peasant family. His childhood and home country made him intimately aware of the seasonality of food and how harsh winter could be. This was the 19th century when electricity was rare, refrigeration in the home was not yet a thing, and feast, famine, and war were an ever-present threat. It is in this time and place he became a staunch communist. Without fossil fuels and motor vehicles, fields were ploughed by hand, horse, or cattle. This was done to sow the remaining seed from the last harvest that had been put aside for sowing in the current season. Without this, there would be little to no food. Seed could not be easily purchased and would be prohibitively expensive. This created a situation in which regional cultivars of wheat and other staple grains would be developed and retained. One that Lysenko was familiar with. The particular variety is known as winter wheat, a grain sown in autumn, entering dormancy over winter and resuming growth in spring, to be harvested either during spring or in summer. This was an idea he carried through to university, where he took an interest in this particular grain. Remember that he came to university having had only a few years where he'd actually known how to read. Despite this, he was eventually able to study at the Kiev Agricultural Institute. While there, he was under the tutelage of Nikolai Vavilov, who encouraged him to pursue this area of interest. Winter wheat itself was not a novel idea, and converting it into spring wheat less so. This was a process of changing a plant so that it could grow in a season for which it did not normally grow. In Eastern Europe, this created a problem. There was a general lack of fodder in winter which could lead to the starvation of cattle. They would need either stored food or to have it growing in the field. This was what Lysenko began focusing on. He eventually claims to have had success with peas. He was able to make them grow in winter in Azerbaijan. This and other discoveries were based on a series of ideas that he summarized as vernalization. He did this by treating wheat seeds and pea seeds with moisture as well as cold. This induced them to start growing in spring where they were previously meant to be growing in winter. This in itself was not a new idea. It was his belief that the trait could be inherited that was. He originally named this process of inheritance Maturism, and then later it was given the name Lysenkoism. This was premised on the results of measuring yield over a small number of hectares. And, given that and what we know later, it's likely that he was creating statistical errors that were important. He believed the grain and then plants would remember being treated with an artificial cold spell. This is on par with the idea in homeopathy that water remembers what it has been exposed to. It also has as much validity to it. It is worth noting at this point that Lysenko had rejected the idea of Mendelian genetics. Mendelian genetics, for those of you who do not know, is the process of two sets of genes being traded during fertilization. This leads to the plant acquiring traits from both of the parent plants. In Mendelian genetics, this involves segregation and independent assortment. In an ideal world, that is a random but equal distribution of the genes. One or more of these genes could be dominant in that process, leading to a particular trait being seen. This was an idea made known in 1865 and then repopularized in 1900. That is about 50 years of evidence and proof to the detractors. From 1900s onwards, it received more and more attention with an ever-growing body of evidence. Lysenko's ideas share much in common with Lamarckism. That is a theory that traits developed to adapt to the environment by a parent will be inherited by the offspring. The standard example is that giraffes will grow a long neck to reach high up into the tree. Their children will then receive those long necks as their parents needed them to survive, and it is adapting to the environment in a single generation. That being, one long-necked giraffe will inevitably produce another. It is not a successive thing occurring over multiple generations. Trofim Lysenko himself became the director of the Soviet Lenin All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences in the 1930s under the auspices of Stalin, and using this theory as his platform. A scientifically unsound, poorly evidenced theory. It is from here that he developed more radical and irrational theories. One that he believed is that plants are self-sacrificing. That is, they do not die to a lack of sunlight or moisture, but so that the healthy plants may live, and that they will then be fed from the death of their comrades when they die. He believed that in one generation, a hybridized crop could achieve the desired output. They could then be crossbred again and continue to produce the same desired product. He had no concerns about the separation or segregation of future breeds, arguing that they should all produce the same final product. He also continued to assume that throughout that lifetime, there would be no alteration or acquisition of different traits due to that crossbreeding and hybridization, that any offspring would inherit the best possible traits. He assumed that there would be no variation or mutations from this crossbreeding or hybridization process. That is, once they had achieved the optimal genes, that they would be forever retained. Further to that, he did not believe in genetics or DNA. The only references he would make to them would be to deny their existence. Much like the homeopathy argument about water, he believed that once a body of something had obtained its particular traits, it would permanently retain them. That meant that the heredity was inherent to the whole plant and not a particular element or aspect of it. It took a bit of time for him to begin developing this and getting the necessary influence required. Part of this was his work with Olga Lepeshinska. They were a biologist who claimed to be able to create cells from the combination of egg yolk and a non-cellular matter. As we know now, that's unlikely to be the case, as a biosynthesis is a non-existent thing. Further to that, sterility and similar wasn't particularly well known at the time, and chances are their work with the egg yolks was not an aseptic one. The combination of their ideas led to some of the most damaging research possible, particularly claims that cells could be made from non-cellular material, and that the Mendelian genetics and meioses were incorrect. Their arguments have long since been disproven. This process and failures in the scientific method led to massive issues for the agricultural sector in the Soviet Union. As anyone with a garden will tell you, his ideas of plants trying to support the healthiest, best plants is false. Despite this, he forced farmers to plant seeds very close together. It was on the premise of his law of life of species. This put forward the idea that plants from the same class never compete with one another. Again, anyone with any experience in a garden will tell you this is patently untrue. The reason he was able to push this idea so hard and with so much success is that the Soviet Union strongly believed that practical application and experience trumped scientific methodologies and reproducible results. His experience as a peasant on a farm gave him the authority to dictate what should or should not work, even if it wasn't functionally effective. This is why Lysenko played such an active and major role in the famines that led to the deaths of millions of Soviet people. His work alone prolonged and increased the effect of the famines seen throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s. Worse yet, his ideas were exported. Lysenkoism was sent to China, and those of you who know your history might be familiar with the great famines of the 1950s under Mao that led to the deaths of even more, where you had up to 7 million dying in Russia, at least 30 million died in China. With such a well-exported idea coming from the Soviet Union, the rest of the world became familiar with the name of Lysenko, and they did not like it. In fact, most other countries and nations were criticizing his ideas on a regular basis, pointing out flaws and problems. He wasn't able to deal with those forces outside of the Soviet Union. Instead of dealing with the detractors and arguments that were put forward, he chose to instead silence and remove anyone who disagreed with him inside of the Soviet Union. Anyone who refused to disagree and publicly denounce genetics found themselves being wrapped up by the secret police and shipped off to gulags. That's if they were lucky. If they weren't lucky, they'd have died in a prison where they were starved to death. The most extremely lucky individuals simply lost their jobs and became destitute. If you were in the particularly cruelly treated category and you did not die of starvation in a prison, you might have wound up in one of the Soviet psychiatric hospitals. You can imagine what effect this had on the Soviet biological science community. It's very much like what happened to the Soviet military under Stalin's purges. Leadership was lost, development was stagnated, and ultimately the efficacy of this field of research was crippled. This was complicated by the further work by the Soviet Union to collectivize and reform the farming practices of the Soviet Union. This involved confiscation of the land, forced labor, and a number of other political processes that led to a decreased productivity and peasants who had no desire to work on their farm as they would see no benefit from their work. This created a whole raft of issues. Lysenko was praised for his ability to get the peasants back on the farms and working. Further to that, he made grand claims about the ability to manipulate the plants, such as wheat, peas, and potatoes, to improve yield, quality, and quantity. It is this success, or at least these claimed successes, that led to Lysenko impressing Stalin. Given that he was a peasant by background and now a rather successful scientist, he was promoted by the Soviet Union. They strongly believed that the working class or the proletariat should be able to lead the way through their experiences of the world, and that great discoveries should be possible. This was all part and parcel of the Soviet Union's policies. The idea was to try and get as many of these poor people into positions of power, much like Mao, who sent the academics into the fields and sent the workers into the academia. There was a complete disconnect between the two's objectives and the methods by which they would get there. Due to how well he got along with Stalin and how the communist regime viewed him, he gained an ever-growing body of influence. This began to encompass the area of research we now know as genetics, and at least within the Soviet Union, he became the Almighty One. He became the Director of Genetics for the Academy of Sciences. This more or less gave him total control over the topic. He retained some degree of this authority in the USSR until a series of events happened. The first, and perhaps most obvious, was the death of Stalin. Stalin had, in a manner of speaking, protected Lysenko from any foreign interference and internal competition. With Stalin's death, this was no longer the case. Shortly before this, Watson and Crick had discovered DNA. After Stalin died, this information and more could more readily perforate the USSR. Lysenko lacked the authority and power to prevent a spread of this indisputable science, a process that directly contradicted and disproved his own body of work and his own theory. This was followed in 1962 when three of the most prominent physicists in the Soviet Union presented a case about Lysenko. They eviscerated his work, labeling it as pseudoscience. Further, they denounced his use of political power, particularly the purges, to remove anyone who could be a possible opponent to his ideology within the scientific community. We now know how thorough and extensive his purges were, on top of those that were conducted by Stalin and other high-ranking communists. In a recent piece coming out in Nature, the exact degree to which Lysenko went to achieve his ends was touched on. This was summarized with the following quote: Zhores, Medvedev, and many other biologists and historians of Soviet biology established long ago Trofim Lysenko's scientific discoveries were fictitious, and part of them were intentionally falsified. End quote. This should be no surprise when he claimed to have produced rye from wheat and cuckoo birds from warblers. Anyone who has a basic understanding of biology, let alone genetics, can appreciate that you cannot produce one species from another immediately. No matter how you cut this problem, no matter how you try and dissect it, you cannot simply produce one species directly from another like that. It either takes many generations and a process of adaptation which we know better as evolution to achieve it, or something has gone terribly wrong. It is in 1948 that we find the crux of this problem. In 1948, it was announced that his theory, Lysenkoism, would be the only theory taught as correct in the Lenin Academy of Agricultural Sciences. That's 1948, at least 14 years before he was denounced in the manner that he was. 14 years in which his damage was taught as the sole theory. Anyone else teaching anything other than that was anathema, and likely unpersoned. This is summarized in a great way by a 1964 quote by the physicist Andrei Sakharov from the General Assembly of the Academy of Sciences, and it is a quote especially apt today. To begin, he is responsible for the shameful backwardness of Soviet biology and genetics in particular, for the dissemination of pseudo-scientific views, for adventurism, for the degradation of learning, and for the defamation, firing, arrest, even death of many genuine scientists. End quote. His reign of damage would not be finalized until after Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, was dismissed in 1964. It was only then that the president of the Academy of Sciences was able to declare that Lysenko's immunity to criticism had officially ended. This was followed, most importantly, by an expert commission who was sent to investigate the records he kept at his experimental farm. This followed from him using highly secretive methods, and to identify just what his ideas were. It was only a few months later that an absolutely devastating critique of Lysenko was made public and eviscerated both his ideas and ultimately what he had been trying to preach, for lack of a better word. It was fundamentally communist propaganda. Lysenko single-handedly set back Soviet biology and genetics research by more than 50 years. He was responsible for the death of over 7 million people in the Soviet Union alone, and possibly upwards of 40 million. His work alone proves many of the issues and things that we are seeing now are worth being aware of. The lack of challenge, the strict adherence to an ideology rather than following the facts and evidence, belief in something for the sake of belief or for political reasons does not ultimately come to any good end, and as is the case with Lysenko, often results in the shame, defamation, and ultimately degradation of others who are honestly acting in the genuine best interests of what they are trying to do, the world, and in line with best practices. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.